Hello friends, my name is Kinjal Vausar, lecturer in EC department from VPMB Polytechnic College. Subject name Principles of Electronic Communication. Then unit name Introduction to Communication Systems, and topic is types of modulation. Next, these are the objectives. So in this, first, types of modulation. Normally two types of modulation, analog modulation and digital modulation. Okay, then next, this is the types of modulation. First is a continuous wave modulation. Continuous wave modulation, otherwise analog modulation. Okay, then pulse digital modulation. Okay, then continuous wave modulation divide into two part. First is the amplitude modulation and second is the angular modulation. Okay, so angular modulation, again two part, frequency modulation and phase modulation. Okay, then pulse digital modulation, two parts, digital modulation and analog modulation. Okay, then digital modulation, that means ki pulse code modulation, and short form of pulse code modulation PCM. Then analog modulation, so analog modulation, pulse amplitude modulation, pulse duration modulation and pulse position modulation. This is the types of modulation. Then detailed explanation about types of modulation. First, analog modulation. So what is analog modulation? When carrier wave is continuous in nature, modulation process is known as continuous wave modulation or analog modulation. Then example of analog modulation is amplitude modulation and angle modulation. Again, what is amplitude modulation? So amplitude modulation, that means ki when amplitude of carrier is varied in accordance with message signal, it is known as amplitude modulation. That means ki carrier no amplitude change થાય છે. Okay, in accordance with the message signal પ્રમાણે, તો એને શું કહેવાય? amplitude modulation. Then next is angle modulation. So what is angle modulation? When angle of carrier is changed according to instantaneous value of modulating signal, it is called angle modulation. So angle change થાય છે carrierનો કોના according to? તો instantaneous value of modulating signal, અને એને શું કહેવાય છે? angle modulation. Then angle modulation. તો angle modulation ના બે પાર્ટ છે, frequency modulation and phase modulation. તો frequency modulation, that means ki the process of carrier signal varied according to the message signal or modulating signal frequency by keeping the amplitude constant is known as a frequency modulation. That means ki frequency modulation માં શું થાય છે? frequency modulation માં carrier ની frequency change થાય છે કોના according to? તો according to message signal or modulating signal. Okay, and at that time amplitude of carrier signal is constant. Then phase modulation. So phase modulation, that means ki process of vary the carrier signal in accordance with the phase of modulating signal or message signal by keeping the frequency constant. And if the amplitude of message or modulating signal is huge, then phase shift will also greater. That means ki phase modulation માં શું થાય છે? કે phase change થાય છે કોના according to change થાય છે phase? તો according to modulating signal or message signal, and at that time frequency is constant. Then pulse modulation. So when the carrier wave is pulse type, then waveform of this modulation process is known as a pulse modulation. Okay, તો જેમાં carrier wave pulse use કરેલા હોય એ ટાઈપના મોડ્યુલેશનને શું કહેવાય? તો pulse modulation કહેવાય. So in pulse modulation, the carrier consists of periodic sequence of rectangular pulses. That means ki pulse કોને કહેવાય? તો pulse modulation, that means ki periodic sequence of rectangular waveform. Then pulse modulation two types ના હોય છે, analog type and digital type. Then pulse modulation. So in analog pulse modulation, amplitude, width, otherwise duration or position of pulse is varied in accordance with sample value of message signal. તો અગેન આમાં શું થાય છે, પલ્સ મોડ્યુલેશનમાં શું થાય છે, એનાલોગ પલ્સ મોડ્યુલેશનમાં ચેન્જ શું થાય છે, એમ્પ્લિટ્યુડ, વિડ્થ, અધરવાઇઝ પોઝિશન ઓફ પલ્સ ઓકે ઇઝ વેરીડ ઇન એકોર્ડન્સ વિથ સેમ્પલ ઓફ મેસેજ સિગ્નલ. અને 3 types of analog pulse modulation: pulse amplitude modulation, pulse width modulation, and pulse position modulation. Okay, then next is the digital modulation. So in digital modulation, message signal to be transmitted is in a digital nature. Okay, so and digital communication involves the transmission information in digital form. So this is the types of modulation. Okay, then detail explain about each one of modulation type. So first, amplitude modulation. So in amplitude modulation, amplitude of carrier signal is varied by modulating signal. Okay, so information signal is modulating signal. That means ki modulating signal is same as an information signal, and high frequency signal which is being modulated is carrier signal. Okay, that means modulating signal is a low frequency signal, otherwise information signal is low frequency signal, and high frequency signal is a carrier signal. Then definition. So instantaneous value of carrier amplitude changes in accordance with amplitude of modulating signal. This is called amplitude modulation. Okay, this is the diagram. So in this diagram, first diagram, signal that means ki modulating signal, otherwise information signal. Then second is a carrier signal. This is the high frequency signal. Modulating signal is low frequency signal, and carrier signal is high frequency signal. And third signal is amplitude modulated signal. That means ki low frequency signal is superimposed upon carrier signal, otherwise high frequency signal. So this is the amplitude modulated signal. So in this amplitude modulated signal, amplitude of carrier, amplitude of carrier is changes in according with to instantaneous value of modulating signal. This is the diagram, amplitude modulated signal diagram. Then frequency modulation. So frequency modulation, in this amplitude of modulated carrier is kept constant. That means ki in frequency modulation amplitude is constant, while its frequency is varied by modulating signal. तो चेंज शू थाय छे फ्रीक्वन्सी मोड्युलेशन में फ्रीक्वन्सी, एम्प्लिट्यूड शू रहे छे केरियरनो कॉन्स्टન્ટ. तो फ्रीक्वन्सी ऑफ केरियर सिग्नल इज वेरीड प्रोपोर्शनल टू amplitude of input modulating signal, and amount of changes in carrier signal, otherwise carrier frequency, produced by amplitude of input modulating signal is called frequency deviation. And carrier frequency swing between maximum frequency and minimum frequency as input varies in its amplitude. And difference between f maximum and fc is known as a frequency deviation. That means ki frequency deviation is equal to f max, maximum frequency, minus carrier frequency, fc. This is the diagram. So in this diagram, first signal is carrier signal, second signal is baseband signal, otherwise information signal. Okay, so in first signal frequency high, then second signal frequency is low, then third signal is frequency modulated signal. So in this signal, first the frequencies, if this baseband signal is increasing, okay, then frequency is increasing up to this, then frequencies increases up to maximum of baseband signal amplitude. Then after that frequencies decreases up to baseband signal amplitude is decreases. That means here see frequency is increases up to here, this is the fc max. Okay, then frequencies decreases, okay, up to this frequency is fc minimum. Okay, that means this is in this frequency modulation, frequency is changed, amplitude is constant. Then phase modulation. So in phase modulation, phase of carrier is varied, otherwise changes in accordance with modulating signal instead of its frequency as in FM. That means कि FM frequency modulation માં શું change થતું હતું? Frequency. तो phase modulation માં શું change થાય? Phase. Greater the amplitude of modulating signal, greater phase shift. Then definition માં શું લખાય? Phase modulation is a type of modulation where phase of carrier signal varies as per amplitude variation of message signal. Then diagram. So first diagram message signal છે, low frequency signal. Second diagram carrier signal, high frequency signal. Okay, so and third diagram phase modulated signal. So in carrier signal, okay, first when phase of message signal is changed here at that point, okay, then phase of carrier signal is changed to 180 degree phase shift. Again here phase amplitude modulated signal is changes. Okay, when phase of message signal is changed, then phase of carrier amplitude is changed. Okay, this is the explanation of phase modulation. Then positive alternation of modulating signal produce a lagging phase shift. Okay, and negative signal produce a leading phase shift. Positive alternation of modulation, that means ki positive alternation of message signal is producing lagging phase shift. Okay, lagging, that means ki this below. Then negative signal produces leading phase shift. This is a negative phase shift, so leading phase. Then phase modulation and frequency modulation are depending on each other. Okay, when the phase of the carrier signal varies, the frequency of carrier signal also varies. Similarly, when the frequency of the carrier signal varies, the phase of carrier signal also varies. However, the phase modulation and frequency modulation are not directly proportional to each other.